What if the deadliest war in human history was not an accident? What if the conflict that consumed over 70 million lives, razed entire cities, and extinguished 6 million Jewish men, women, and children in industrialized murder was not the result of misunderstanding, miscalculation, or bad luck, but was instead the deliberate, calculated, and deeply personal project of one man who had been planning it for the better part of 2 decades? Because that is precisely what the historical record shows. Adolf Hitler did not stumble into the Second World War. He drove toward it, methodically and with extraordinary patience, removing every obstacle that stood between Germany and total war. The statesmen who tried to stop him, the generals who doubted him, the diplomats who thought they had appeased him, and the nations that thought they could contain him all underestimated the same thing: the sheer depth of his conviction that war was not only inevitable, but necessary, desirable, and ordained. But why? What were the real reasons Hitler had to start World War II? Not the simplified textbook explanations, but the full, complex, historically documented catalogue of pressures, obsessions, ideological imperatives, and strategic calculations that made September 1st, 1939, feel to Hitler less like a decision and more like a destiny. In this video, we will find out. So, without further ado, let us start with the first reason on our list. To understand why Hitler launched the most destructive war in history, you have to travel back 20 years before the first shots were fired, to a moment of supreme humiliation that scarred an entire generation of Germans and ignited a fury that would not be extinguished for 3 decades. It was June 28th, 1919, and inside the magnificent Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, the very room in which the German Empire had been triumphantly proclaimed just 48 years earlier, the representatives of the German government sat down to sign the Treaty of Versailles. They had no choice. Germany had been told that if they did not sign, the Allied blockade strangling their country would continue, and the armistice that had silenced the guns on November 11th, 1918, would be cancelled. The German delegation signed, and in doing so, they accepted terms that would define European politics for the next 2 decades and hand Adolf Hitler his most powerful political weapon. The Treaty of Versailles was, by any objective measure, one of the most punishing peace settlements in modern history. Germany was forced to accept sole responsibility for the war under Article 231, the infamous War Guilt Clause, which made Germany legally and morally responsible for all losses and damages suffered by the Allied powers during the conflict. This was not merely a bureaucratic provision. It was a moral verdict, a declaration to the world that Germany was uniquely guilty, uniquely criminal, uniquely deserving of punishment. For millions of Germans who genuinely believed their country had fought a defensive war, or at the very least a war no different from those fought by any other great power, this clause was an act of civilizational humiliation. It became the foundational grievance of Weimar Germany, the wound that never healed, the injustice that every demagogue could exploit, and no demagogue exploited it more brilliantly or more ruthlessly than Hitler. But the War Guilt Clause was only the beginning. The territorial provisions of the treaty stripped Germany of approximately 13% of its pre-war territory and 10% of its population. Alsace-Lorraine, seized from France in 1871 following Germany's victory in the Franco-Prussian War, was returned. The Rhineland, the industrial heartland west of the Rhine River, was to be occupied by Allied forces for 15 years and then permanently demilitarized. The Saar region, rich in coal, was placed under League of Nations administration and its coal mines handed to France as reparations. In the east, the situation was even more painful. The new state of Poland, reconstituted after more than a century of partition, was awarded a corridor of territory that stretched to the Baltic Sea, cutting off East Prussia from the rest of Germany and leaving the historic German port city of Danzig as a so-called free city under League of Nations protection. It was a geographical absurdity that Germans across the political spectrum regarded as an open wound, West Prussia, and Posen, regions with large German populations, became Polish. North Schleswig was transferred to Denmark after a plebiscite. The Sudetenland, home to more than 3 million ethnic Germans, was assigned to the newly created state of Czechoslovakia. Germany was stripped of all its overseas colonies, and then came the military provisions. The German army, the proud institution that had fought France, Russia, Britain, and the United States to a near draw, was reduced to just 100,000 men. The general staff was abolished. Germany was forbidden to possess tanks, military aircraft, submarines, or heavy artillery. The navy was gutted, with the most powerful ships handed over to the British, though most of the fleet was scuttled at Scapa Flow by German officers who could not stomach surrender. And finally, the reparations. Germany was ordered to pay the Allied powers a sum eventually fixed in 1921 at 132 billion gold marks, roughly equivalent to several $1 trillion in modern terms, an amount that would take generations to repay, and that even the Allied economists who helped calculate it knew Germany could never fully discharge. What the peacemakers at Versailles created, whether intentionally or not, was a resentment engine. They had imposed terms harsh enough to humiliate and cripple Germany, but not harsh enough to permanently destroy it as a great power. They had, in the famous phrase attributed to French Marshal Ferdinand Foch, not made peace at all, but merely an armistice for 20 years. Foch was wrong only about the number of years. It was exactly 20 years and 65 days from the signing of the Versailles Treaty to the German invasion of Poland. Hitler understood this resentment better than any other politician of his era because he shared it in the most visceral and personal way imaginable. He had been a corporal in the German army during the First World War, he had been wounded in combat, and he had been blinded in a British gas attack near Ypres in October 1918. He was still in a military hospital, slowly recovering his sight when the armistice came. He would later describe the moment he learned of Germany's surrender as the worst day of his life, a shattering personal catastrophe that he experienced as a betrayal rather than a defeat. For Hitler, Versailles was not just a diplomatic settlement, it was a declaration of war against the German people, and the entire trajectory of his political career was directed toward its destruction. The stab-in-the-back myth, known in German as the Dolchstoßlegende, was one of the most consequential lies in modern history, and it was the lie that made Nazism possible. The theory was simple and seductive. Germany had not been defeated on the battlefield. The German army had been fighting magnificently. The front lines had never collapsed, and German soldiers had been unbeaten when the armistice was declared in November 1918. Therefore, the defeat had come not from military failure, but from betrayal. Treacherous elements on the home front, specifically Jews, Marxists, pacifists and socialists, had stabbed the heroic German army in the back, undermining the war effort, fomenting revolution, and forcing a surrender that the soldiers themselves would never have accepted. This myth was not born in a vacuum. In 1919, General Erich Ludendorff, who had been the de facto military dictator of Germany during the final years of the war, testified before a Reichstag committee that Germany's defeat was the result of domestic subversion rather than military failure. The irony was staggering. It was Ludendorff himself who, in late September 1918, had told Kaiser Wilhelm II that Germany must seek an immediate armistice because the military situation was hopeless. He had demanded peace. He had engineered the end of the war because he knew Germany was beaten. But within weeks he was telling a different story, and that different story became the founding legend of the nationalist right. The Dolchstoßlegende solved a psychological problem that was otherwise insoluble for millions of proud, patriotic Germans. How could Germany have lost? The country had fought the entire world for 4 years and come close to winning. Its soldiers had displayed extraordinary courage and skill. Its scientists had developed some of the most innovative weapons of the war. Its army had defeated Russia, had nearly reached Paris, had held the Western Front against Britain and France, and eventually the United States for years. And then suddenly it was over, and Germany had lost everything. The only explanation that preserved German dignity, that did not require Germans to accept that they had simply been outfought and out-resourced by a coalition of more powerful enemies, was the betrayal narrative. And the betrayal narrative needed culprits. The Dolchstoßlegende pointed to Jews in particular, drawing on centuries of anti-Semitic prejudice that had portrayed Jews as rootless internationalists whose loyalties lay not with the nations that hosted them, but with a global Jewish conspiracy. Hitler absorbed this conspiracy theory deeply, and for the rest of his life he treated it not as a political fiction but as a historical fact. He genuinely believed that Germany had been betrayed in 1918. He genuinely believed that Jews and Marxists were the primary agents of that betrayal. And he genuinely believed that the entire apparatus of the Versailles settlement was a Jewish instrument for keeping Germany subjugated. These were not cynical talking points for public consumption. They were the core of Hitler's worldview, and they drove his decisions at every critical juncture from his first public speech in 1919 to his final testament dictated in the Berlin bunker in April 1945. For Hitler, then, the imperative to undo Versailles was not merely a political program, it was a personal and ideological crusade, a sacred obligation to the memory of the German soldiers who had fought and died only to be betrayed, and a historical necessity for the German people's survival. Every revision of the treaty, from the reoccupation of the Rhineland to the annexation of Austria, to the destruction of Czechoslovakia, to the invasion of Poland, was in Hitler's mind a step in the restoration of German dignity and power. And when he had restored what Versailles had taken, when he had reversed every clause and humiliation of the peace settlement, that still would not be enough. Because the roots of Hitler's drive to war went far deeper than Versailles. They reached into an ideological system so radical, so total, and so murderous that no revision of a peace treaty could satisfy it. To understand that ideological system, we must understand the man who created it. Adolf Hitler was born on April 20th, 1889, in Braunau am Inn, a small town on the border between Austria and Bavaria. He was the fourth child of Alois Hitler, a customs official who was himself the illegitimate son of a domestic servant, and Clara Pölzl, Alois's niece and third wife. Hitler's childhood was not the story of grinding poverty and constant brutality that his later propagandists sometimes implied, but it was not a happy one. His father was authoritarian, demanding, and frequently brutal toward the children. 3 of Hitler's siblings died in infancy, and his closest brother Edmund died of measles when Hitler was 10. Hitler was close to his mother Clara, whose death from breast cancer in December 1907, when Hitler was 18, devastated him. His relationship with his father was contentious, defined primarily by Hitler's insistence that he wanted to be an artist and his father's contempt for such ambitions. When Alois died in January 1903, Hitler later described it without evident grief. In 1907, Hitler applied to the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts and was rejected, a failure he would nurse as a personal wound for the rest of his life. He applied again in 1908 and was rejected a second time. The rejection board noted that he showed some talent for architecture but too little for figure drawing. Hitler spent the next 5 years in Vienna in deepening poverty, living in flop houses, selling postcard paintings, and absorbing the virulent anti-Semitic politics that characterized Vienna in the era of Mayor Karl Lueger, the charismatic demagogue whose blend of populism, Catholic conservatism, and Jew baiting provided a template that Hitler would adapt and radicalize for his own purposes. It was in Vienna that Hitler's anti-Semitism crystallized from a vague prejudice into a consuming obsession. He later claimed in Mein Kampf that his first encounter with an Eastern European Jew in traditional dress on a Viennese street triggered a sudden revelation that the Jews were a racial rather than a religious group, and that they were fundamentally alien to European civilization. Whether this specific incident occurred exactly as he described it is uncertain, but the direction of his intellectual development in Vienna is not. By the time Hitler left Vienna for Munich in May 1913, he was already a committed anti-Semite who saw the world through the lens of racial struggle. It is worth pausing here to ask a question that historians have debated for decades. Why was Hitler's anti-Semitism so extreme, so consuming, and so ultimately genocidal? The answer lies partly in the intellectual environment of fin de siècle Vienna and Central Europe more broadly, where pseudo-scientific racial theories had achieved a degree of mainstream respectability that seems almost incomprehensible today. The social Darwinism of Herbert Spencer, the racial hierarchies of Arthur de Gobineau and Houston Stewart Chamberlain, the eugenics movement that flourished across Europe and America in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, all of these provided a vocabulary and a conceptual framework in which the idea of racial struggle for survival and dominance seemed not merely acceptable, but scientifically grounded. For Hitler, who had a voracious but undisciplined mind, and who read widely but uncritically, Absorbing whatever confirmed his existing prejudices and rejecting whatever challenged them, these ideas became the architecture of a totalizing worldview in which everything in history, politics, culture, and economics could be explained by the eternal struggle between races. Jews in this framework were not merely a minority group with distinct cultural practices. They were a uniquely dangerous race whose defining characteristic was their parasitic relationship with other peoples. Jews, Hitler believed, could not create civilization. They could only corrupt and destroy the civilizations created by the productive Aryan race. Every great catastrophe in German history, from the military defeat of 1918 to the humiliations of Versailles to the economic chaos of the early 1920s, was in Hitler's mind ultimately traceable to Jewish manipulation. This belief was not peripheral to his political program. It was its central driving engine. Munich, where Hitler arrived in May 1913, was in many ways better suited to his temperament than Vienna. It was the capital of Bavaria, which had its own strong tradition of German nationalism, a vibrant artistic and intellectual culture, and a political climate that, in the post-war years, became one of the most chaotic and violent in Europe. When the First World War broke out in August 1914, Hitler famously knelt in the Odeonsplatz, photographed in a crowd of jubilant Münchners, his face expressing what appears to be genuine ecstasy. He immediately volunteered for the Bavarian army despite being an Austrian citizen and was accepted. For Hitler, who had spent years as a purposeless drifter with no stable identity, no regular income, and no clear future, the war was a liberation. He had purpose, he had comrades, he had a cause. He served as a regimental messenger, a dangerous role that involved carrying orders under fire between regimental headquarters and the front lines. He was awarded the Iron Cross Second Class in December 1914 and the Iron Cross First Class in August 1918, the latter a distinguished honour rarely given to a corporal and recommended by a Jewish officer, Lieutenant Hugo Gutmann, a fact that Hitler never acknowledged. He was wounded twice. He was temporarily blinded by a gas attack in October 1918. He was, by all accounts, a brave and committed soldier. But he was also, by the testimony of his comrades, a peculiar one, solitary, humourless, given to long monologues on political and racial topics, and seemingly indifferent to the comforts and pleasures that other soldiers sought during rest periods. The trenches did not educate Hitler or moderate his extremism. They confirmed and intensified it. The Germany that Hitler returned to after the armistice was a country in political and social crisis. The Kaiser had abdicated. The German Republic had been proclaimed from the window of the Reichstag. Revolution was spreading from the naval mutinies in Kiel and Wilhelmshaven to the streets of Berlin and Munich. In November 1918, a Soviet-style council republic was briefly proclaimed in Munich under Kurt Eisner, a Jewish socialist intellectual, before being crushed by right-wing paramilitary units known as Freikorps in May 1919, in an orgy of violence that left hundreds dead, and confirmed Hitler's conviction that Jewish Marxists were the agents of German destruction. Hitler remained in the army during this period, working as a political instructor tasked with countering socialist and pacifist influences among demobilized troops. It was in this capacity that he attended a meeting of the German Workers' Party in September 1919, a small and obscure nationalist group. He did not intend to join but found himself drawn into an argument with a speaker who proposed that Bavaria should separate from Germany and unite with Austria. Hitler objected so forcefully and so eloquently that the party's founder, Anton Drexler, was impressed and invited him to join the committee. Hitler accepted, receiving member card number 555, though the party's numbering started at 501 to make it appear larger than it was. Within months, Hitler had transformed this tiny fringe group into the movement that would eventually seize control of Germany. The question of what drove Hitler toward war cannot be separated from the question of what he believed. And what Hitler believed, in its most essential form, was a racial cosmology in which humanity was divided into a hierarchy of races engaged in a perpetual struggle for survival and dominance. At the top of this hierarchy was the Aryan race, which Hitler identified primarily with the Nordic peoples of Northern and Western Europe, and above all with the Germanic peoples of Central Europe. Aryans, in Hitler's cosmology, were the sole creators of genuine civilization. Every great cultural, scientific and artistic achievement in human history was the product of Aryan genius. Every decline of a civilization could be traced to the contamination of Aryan racial stock through interbreeding with inferior races. At the bottom of Hitler's racial hierarchy were Africans and Romani people, but the most uniquely dangerous non-Aryan group in his thinking were not those at the bottom of the hierarchy, but the Jews, whom Hitler regarded as a uniquely destructive counter-race. Unlike the Slavs, whom Hitler considered racially inferior but capable of being useful as slave labour, Jews were, in his view, actively malevolent. They were not merely passive targets of Aryan domination, but active agents working to destroy the Aryan race through cultural contamination, racial mixing, financial manipulation, and political subversion. Marxism, in Hitler's ideological framework, was a Jewish invention designed to destroy the class solidarity of the Aryan nation by substituting international class struggle for national racial unity. Democracy was a Jewish instrument for putting government in the hands of Jewish manipulated majorities rather than the natural aristocracy of racial talent and will. The free press was a Jewish weapon for poisoning the minds of the people. International finance was a Jewish mechanism for extracting the productive wealth of Aryan nations. It was a totalizing conspiracy theory of breathtaking comprehensiveness, and it led logically toward a conclusion that Hitler did not initially state publicly, but that was implicit in his worldview from a very early stage. The problem of the Jews could not be solved by assimilation or emigration alone. It required their physical elimination. This ideological core, this absolute conviction that the German people were in a life-or-death racial struggle against Jewish destruction, was one of the primary drivers of Hitler's decision to make war. Because if the struggle was truly existential, if Germany did not act, then Germany and indeed all of Aryan civilization would be destroyed. War was not merely justified. It was obligatory. It was the most fundamental act of self-defense imaginable. Every concession, every compromise, every year of peace was, in Hitler's mind, a year gained by Germany's racial enemies to consolidate their power and tighten their grip. This thinking made war not an option of last resort, but a positive good, a cleansing fire that would purge the racial enemies of Germany and establish the dominance of the Aryan race for centuries to come. When we ask why Hitler had to start World War II, we must understand that for Hitler himself, the answer was not primarily strategic or diplomatic. It was biological. It was racial. It was a matter of survival or extinction. And a man who genuinely believes he is fighting for the survival of his people will do things that a man engaged in a conventional political dispute will never do. Beyond racial ideology, there was a second great ideological pillar that made war, in Hitler's mind, not merely desirable, but necessary. That pillar was the concept of Lebensraum, or living space. The idea was not invented by Hitler. It had been circulating in German geographical and nationalist thought since the late 19th century, developed above all by the geographer Friedrich Ratzel, and popularized in political discourse by the Pan-German League. Its core premise was that a nation's power and vitality depended on the amount of territory it controlled. A nation cramped within narrow borders could not feed its growing population, could not develop its economic potential, and would inevitably decline relative to nations with more space. Germany, by this logic, was dangerously underpowered. It had a large, talented, and productive population, squeezed into a relatively small territory in the centre of Europe, dependent on imports for critical raw materials and food. Every other great power had colonies or vast continental territories that gave them strategic depth, resources, and room to grow. Britain had its empire. France had Algeria and sub-Saharan Africa. The United States had an entire continent. Russia had Siberia. Germany had nothing comparable, and what it had was taken away at Versailles. This geographic disadvantage, combined with the supposed racial destiny of the German people as the master race of Europe, pointed in only one direction: eastward expansion. Hitler had absorbed the Lebensraum concept and made it central to his political thinking by the time he wrote Mein Kampf in 1924, and he returned to it obsessively throughout his career. The target of German expansion was not the colonial world, but the vast territories of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. In Hitler's geopolitical vision, the Ukrainian steppe, the fertile black earth of the East, the mineral wealth of the Urals, the oil fields of the Caucasus, these were the lands that would give Germany the continental empire it needed to compete with Britain and the United States in the long run. Russia itself was in Hitler's view perfectly suited for conquest because it was run by Jews. The Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 was, for Hitler, the supreme example of Jewish political subversion in action. Jews had used Marxist ideology to overthrow the Aryan leadership of Russia and replace it with Jewish Bolshevism, leaving the Slavic masses leaderless, demoralized, and ripe for domination. All that was needed was a decisive German military stroke to shatter the brittle shell of Soviet power and reveal the emptiness beneath. Germany would then colonize the conquered eastern territories, expelling or exterminating the indigenous Slavic populations and settling German farmers in their place, creating a continental empire that would make Germany permanently self-sufficient in food and raw materials and would guarantee Aryan dominance for 1,000 years. This Lebensraum concept was, at one level, a strategic calculation about resources and geography, but it was also deeply ideological, inseparable from Hitler's racial worldview. The Slavic peoples of Eastern Europe were, in his thinking, racial inferiors whose historic function was to serve the Germanic master race. Their lands had no legitimate owner in the ideological framework that Hitler had constructed. They were simply territory waiting for a race vigorous and ruthless enough to claim it. And behind the Slavic buffer states in the vast spaces of the Soviet Union were the Jewish Bolsheviks, simultaneously the racial enemies of the Aryan people and the geopolitical obstacle to German continental dominance. Destroying Soviet power would therefore accomplish two objectives at once. It would eliminate the Jewish Bolshevik threat to Germany's racial integrity, and it would open up the Lebensraum that Germany needed for its long-term survival and dominance. War with the Soviet Union was therefore, for Hitler, not merely probable or even certain, but metaphysically necessary. It was the culminating act of the entire political program he had been developing since the early 1920s. Everything else, the seizure of power in Germany, the consolidation of the Nazi dictatorship, the rearmament of Germany, the absorption of Austria and Czechoslovakia, the conquest of Poland, was in some sense preparation for the decisive confrontation with the Soviet Union. Hitler did not hide this. He stated it clearly in Mein Kampf, published in 2 volumes in 1925 and 1926, a book that sold several 100,000 copies in Germany during the Weimar years and millions after Hitler came to power. A book whose central arguments were available to any statesman, diplomat, or journalist who cared to read it. The Great Depression that swept the world after the Wall Street crash of October 1929 was the economic catastrophe that gave Hitler his political opportunity, and it constitutes one of the most important proximate reasons why war became possible when it did. Germany's economic situation in 1929 was already fragile. The Weimar Republic's economy had never fully recovered from the hyperinflation crisis of 1923, when the German mark became so worthless that workers were paid twice a day because prices doubled between morning and afternoon, when Germans needed wheelbarrows full of cash to buy a loaf of bread, when the life savings of the German middle class were wiped out completely. That trauma had barely been absorbed when the Great Depression arrived, and its impact on Germany was devastating. The country was heavily dependent on American loans under the Dawes Plan, which had stabilized the currency and allowed a degree of recovery. When those loans were called in after the crash, the German economy collapsed with extraordinary speed. By 1932, at the depth of the Depression, Germany had over 6 million unemployed workers, roughly 1 in 3 of the industrial workforce. Millions more were on reduced hours or in poverty. Families who had managed to rebuild modest prosperity after the hyperinflation found themselves destitute again. Young men graduated from school or university into a labour market with no jobs. Farmers saw their incomes collapse as agricultural prices fell. Small business owners went bankrupt. The social fabric of German society was tearing apart. Into this crisis stepped Adolf Hitler, offering a program of national revival that spoke directly to the humiliations and resentments of every suffering German. He offered an explanation for their misery, the Jews, Marxists, and the Versailles diktat, and he offered a solution: national unity, rearmament, territorial expansion, and the destruction of Germany's enemies. His speeches, delivered with an intensity and emotional power that no other politician of his era could match, transformed him from a fringe extremist into a mass movement politician. The Nazi vote rose from 2.6% in the 1928 Reichstag elections to 18.3% in 1930 and 37.4% in July 1932, making the Nazis the largest party in the German parliament. Hitler had not simply benefited from the Depression, he had exploited it with surgical precision, identifying which social groups were most vulnerable and tailoring his message to each. He promised the unemployed workers jobs. He promised the farmers better prices and protection from international competition. He promised the middle class the restoration of their savings and social status. He promised the industrialists protection from communism and the prospects of lucrative rearmament contracts. He promised the army officers the restoration of German military greatness and the abrogation of Versailles. And above all, he promised all Germans the one thing that 20 years of humiliation, defeat, inflation, and economic catastrophe had made them desperate for: pride. On January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany by President Paul von Hindenburg, a decision that the aged Field Marshal and head of state made with profound reluctance and for reasons that had everything to do with short-term political calculation and nothing to do with any understanding of the monster he was unleashing. Hindenburg had despised Hitler for years. He called him the Bohemian corporal. He considered him vulgar, unqualified, and unfit for high office. But the conservative politicians who advised Hindenburg, men like Franz von Papen, who had briefly served as chancellor himself, convinced the old man that Hitler could be managed. They thought they could use the Nazi movement's mass electoral support as a vehicle for a right-wing authoritarian government, while keeping Hitler hemmed in by experienced politicians in the cabinet. It was one of the most catastrophic miscalculations in the history of democratic politics. Within months, Hitler had used a succession of crises, manufactured and genuine, to dismantle the Weimar Republic and erect a personal dictatorship more complete and more totalitarian than any state that had previously existed in German history. The burning of the Reichstag building on February 27, 1933, provided Hitler with the emergency he needed. A young Dutch communist named Marinus van der Lubbe was caught at the scene, apparently acting alone, but the Nazis immediately declared it a communist conspiracy and used it to justify the Reichstag fire decree, which suspended civil liberties, legalized mass arrests, and effectively ended the rule of law in Germany overnight. 4 weeks later, the Enabling Act of March 23, 1933, passed with the support of the Catholic Centre Party after Hitler made promises of religious freedom he never intended to keep, gave the cabinet, meaning Hitler, the power to make laws without parliamentary approval for 4 years. Germany had ceased to be a republic. The machinery of the Nazi state then moved with extraordinary speed. Trade unions were dissolved and replaced with a single Nazi-controlled labour organisation. Political parties were banned or dissolved themselves out of fear. The federal structure of Germany was abolished as individual states lost their autonomy to the Central Reich government. The judiciary was brought under party control. The civil service was purged of Jews and political opponents. The press was muzzled, and the propaganda ministry under Joseph Goebbels began the systematic control of all information available to the German public. And the terror, embodied in the SS under Heinrich Himmler and the secret state police, the Gestapo, silenced those who might have resisted. The speed and completeness of the Nazi seizure of power had profound implications for the question of why Hitler was able to start World War II. Because the elimination of domestic opposition meant that Hitler's foreign policy, which the conservative establishment had expected to moderate, was instead the personal policy of a dictator accountable to no one. There was no parliament that could vote down his war plans. There was no independent press that could expose his deceptions. There was no political opposition that could mobilize public opinion against him. There was, by 1934, following Hindenburg's death, not even a head of state whose authority could theoretically constrain him. Hitler merged the offices of Chancellor and President, declared himself Führer and Reich Chancellor, and required the entire German military to swear a personal oath of loyalty not to the German state or constitution, but to Adolf Hitler himself by name. This personal oath would prove critically important in the years ahead, when German generals who had doubts about Hitler's military plans found themselves constrained by a commitment that they regarded as binding in a way that no merely institutional or constitutional obligation could be. The removal of domestic checks on Hitler's power was therefore not merely a domestic German story. It was one of the structural preconditions for World War. Having secured absolute power at home, Hitler moved immediately and systematically to dismantle the Versailles settlement and rebuild German military strength. The first great act of this program came in March 1935, when Hitler announced that Germany had already been secretly rearming and would now openly reintroduce conscription, building the Wehrmacht toward a peacetime strength of 36 divisions, roughly 500,000 men. This was an open and flagrant violation of the Treaty of Versailles, which had limited the German army to 100,000 volunteers and absolutely prohibited conscription. The reaction of the Allied powers was revealing. Britain, France, and Italy, meeting at Stresa in April 1935, condemned Germany's action but took no practical steps to reverse it. A few weeks later, Britain concluded the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, which allowed Germany to build a navy up to 35% of the size of the Royal Navy's surface fleet and an equal submarine force. This bilateral agreement, concluded without consulting France or Italy, effectively gave British approval to German rearmament in the naval sphere and fatally undermined the united front that France and Britain had briefly seemed to present at Stresa. Hitler was jubilant. He had broken one of Versailles' most fundamental provisions, and the British had essentially thanked him for it. The pace of German rearmament accelerated dramatically after 1935. The Wehrmacht, reborn from the skeleton Reichswehr of the Weimar years, grew with startling speed. By 1939, Germany had an army of over 100 divisions, a Luftwaffe that was among the most modern and powerful air forces in the world, and a navy that, while still smaller than Britain's, included advanced submarine and surface radar capabilities. But the scale of German rearmament also created a problem that would prove central to the timing of Hitler's decision for war. It was financially unsustainable. The German economy, while impressively revived from the depths of the Depression by massive state spending on infrastructure and armaments, was generating levels of debt and inflation that would eventually become unmanageable. Hjalmar Schacht, the brilliant but increasingly alarmed economics minister, warned Hitler repeatedly that the rearmament program was outrunning the country's financial capacity. By 1937 and 1938, Germany was running out of foreign exchange to pay for imported raw materials. The armaments boom that had eliminated unemployment and generated political support was consuming resources faster than the German economy could produce them. Hitler's response to this economic dilemma was not to slow down the rearmament, but to accelerate the timeline for territorial expansion. New territories would provide raw materials, food, industrial capacity, and the economic base for the next phase of expansion. The economic logic, in other words, pointed toward war sooner rather than later. This was not a minor consideration. It was one of the key structural forces that made 1939 the year Hitler chose for the initiation of the European War. The reoccupation of the Rhineland on March 7, 1936, was in many ways the most audacious and decisive gamble of Hitler's pre-war career, and the fact that it succeeded without military resistance from France or Britain fundamentally altered the diplomatic landscape of Europe. The Rhineland, the industrially vital strip of German territory west of the Rhine River, had been demilitarized under the Versailles Treaty and then reconfirmed as demilitarized by the Locarno Treaties of 1925, which Germany had signed voluntarily. The prohibition on German troops in the Rhineland was therefore not merely a Versailles imposition, but an international commitment freely entered into by Germany, making its violation doubly provocative. When Hitler sent a force of just 19 battalions, some 3,000 soldiers, with orders to withdraw immediately if French troops responded, the German generals were terrified. The French army could easily have crushed this tiny force. General Alfred Jodl later testified that the period after the marching in of troops was the most nerve-wracking of his life. Colonel Günther Blumentritt estimated that the German force could have resisted French troops for about 1 hour. But France did not move. Crucially, Britain had no appetite for military confrontation, and without British support, France's more cautious political leadership was unwilling to act. The gamble succeeded completely. The lesson Hitler drew from the Rhineland was the lesson he would draw again and again until it led him to his greatest miscalculations. The Western democracies lacked the will to fight. They were soft. They were morally compromised by pacifism, financial timidity, and a horror of repeating the losses of the First World War. Their leaders were mediocre. Their publics were war-weary. They could be bluffed, threatened, and blackmailed. Each successful bluff confirmed Hitler's contempt for Western leadership and his conviction that he could push further without triggering the military response that alone could stop him. Each successful bluff also shifted the strategic balance more decisively in Germany's favour, and shifted it more than even Hitler initially understood, because the Rhineland contained the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, where the steel and coal and chemical industries that underpinned the Rearmament programme were concentrated. A French occupation of the Rhineland would not merely have been a military embarrassment for Germany, it would have crippled the Rearmament programme and almost certainly ended Hitler's regime. That this is what France should have done was understood by a number of perspicacious observers at the time, including the young Winston Churchill, who warned repeatedly throughout the mid-1930s that each year of inaction was a year of growing danger. He was right, and he was ignored. In the summer and autumn of 1936, Hitler formalized his strategic thinking in a document that reveals with startling clarity the relationship between his ideological commitments and his decision for war. This document, known as the Four-Year Plan Memorandum, was written by Hitler personally in August 1936 and distributed to only a handful of top officials, including Hermann Göring, who was put in charge of implementing it. The memorandum begins with a stark declaration of Hitler's fundamental premise. The Marxist Soviet state poses an existential threat to Germany and to European civilization. Germany must prepare for the coming confrontation. The German economy must be put on a war footing. The German army must be combat ready within 4 years. The German economy must be capable of sustaining a war within 4 years. These were not aspirations or long-term goals. They were deadlines, and they implied a specific timetable. Germany would be in a position to fight the decisive war, the war against the Soviet Union, sometime around 1940. Everything in the intervening years was preparation. The Spanish Civil War, which erupted in July 1936 and lasted until March 1939, provided Hitler with an unexpected but enormously valuable opportunity that connects directly to the reasons he felt confident enough to start the European War in 1939. Hitler intervened in Spain on behalf of the nationalist forces of General Francisco Franco with a mixed military unit called the Condor Legion, composed of aircraft, anti-tank units, and ground support personnel. The intervention served multiple German interests simultaneously. It tested German weapons and tactics under real combat conditions. It provided German pilots, tank crews, and infantrymen with combat experience. It diverted British and French attention. It helped secure the nationalist victory that kept a potentially hostile leftist Spain from flanking France. And it gave Hitler's generals the operational feedback they needed to refine the Blitzkrieg doctrine of rapid armoured breakthrough that would prove so devastatingly effective in 1939 and 1940. The destruction of the Basque town of Guernica by Condor Legion aircraft in April 1937, immortalised in Picasso's monumental painting, demonstrated what the Luftwaffe could do to civilian populations. It was a useful signal to send to potential enemies. The terror bombing of civilians would become a central element of Luftwaffe doctrine, exploiting exactly the fear of aerial bombardment that had been building in European public consciousness since the airship raids of the First World War. The year 1937 was in many respects the pivotal year of the pre-war period, the year in which Hitler moved from strategic preparation to operational planning and began to communicate his intentions to the small circle of military and civilian leaders who needed to know. On November 5, 1937, Hitler convened a secret conference at the Reich Chancellery with his war minister, Field Marshal Werner von Blomberg, the 3 service chiefs, Admiral Erich Raeder of the Navy, General Werner von Fritsch of the Army, and General Hermann Göring of the Luftwaffe, and his foreign minister, Konstantin von Neurath. What Hitler told them that afternoon, recorded in a summary by his military adjutant, Colonel Friedrich Hossbach, became known as the Hossbach Memorandum and stands as one of the most important documents in the historiography of the Second World War. Hitler told his generals that Germany's problem was the need for Lebensraum. This could not be solved by economic means, but only by the use of force, and force always involved risk. Germany must act no later than 1943 to 1945, because after that date, Germany's military advantage over its potential enemies would begin to decline, as France and Britain rearmed. 2 specific scenarios for earlier action were outlined. If France were internally paralysed by political crisis, or if France were engaged in war with another power, Germany should seize the opportunity to liquidate Austria and Czechoslovakia. These two targets came first, before the Great Eastern Campaign, because Austria's and Czechoslovakia's incorporation would shorten Germany's borders, free up military resources, provide additional manpower, and eliminate the threat of a two-front war in the west while Germany advanced east. The Hossbach Conference was not an operational war plan. It was a statement of strategic intention, a declaration by Hitler to his top commanders that war was coming, that the timetable was fixed, and that the conquest of Europe was the deliberate policy of the German state. The reactions of the men who heard this declaration were instructive. Blomberg and Fritsch expressed serious reservations. They worried that Britain and France would intervene, that Germany was not yet ready for a major war, and that the scenarios Hitler described were dangerously optimistic. Von Neurath was equally alarmed. 3 months later, in February 1938, Hitler used manufactured scandals to remove all 3 men from their positions. Blomberg was discredited after revelations that his new wife had appeared in pornographic photographs, a revelation that came suspiciously quickly after the marriage Hitler had attended as a witness. Fritsch was falsely accused of homosexuality by a Gestapo agent with a manufactured dossier. He was later exonerated by a military court but never restored to his command, and was killed leading an artillery regiment in the siege of Warsaw in 1939, in what many historians believe was a deliberate attempt to find a military death. Von Neurath was replaced as foreign minister by the compliant Joachim von Ribbentrop. Blomberg's position as war minister was abolished, with Hitler taking personal command of the armed forces and creating the OKW, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, as his personal military staff under the servile Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel. The result of this palace purge was that the men in the top military and diplomatic positions were now men who had demonstrated willingness to do whatever Hitler ordered, without question. The internal break on Hitler's war plans that the Hossbach Conference had briefly suggested existed was removed. Austria had been a target of German nationalist ambition since at least the end of the First World War, when the rump Austrian state had voted to unite with Germany only to be forbidden from doing so by the Versailles and Saint-Germain-en-Laye treaties. For Hitler, who was himself an Austrian by birth and who had always regarded the separation of Germany and Austria as an artificial crime against German nationhood, the Anschluss was both a personal and ideological imperative. But it was also a strategic necessity. Austria controlled the mountain passes of the Alps, the Danube corridor into southeastern Europe, and access to the Balkans. Its incorporation into Germany would envelop Czechoslovakia on 3 sides, making that country's strategic position untenable. And it would add 7 million German-speaking people and their economic resources to the Reich. On February 12, 1938, Hitler summoned Austrian Chancellor Kurt Schuschnigg to his Berghof retreat near Berchtesgaden and subjected him to hours of verbal intimidation, threats and demands that Austria effectively surrender its independence. Schuschnigg, realizing that neither France nor Britain would intervene and that he had no military capacity to resist alone, initially agreed to Hitler's demands but then called a plebiscite on Austrian independence for March 13th, hoping a popular vote would strengthen his hand. Hitler panicked, fearing the plebiscite might produce a genuine majority for Austrian independence, and on March 11th demanded that it be cancelled and Schuschnigg resign. Schuschnigg complied. That same evening, the German army marched into Austria. What happened when the Wehrmacht crossed the Austrian border on the morning of March 12, 1938, astonished even Hitler. Instead of the tense confrontation he had feared might provoke international intervention, the German soldiers were met with flowers and cheering crowds. The Anschluss was genuinely popular, not merely among Austrian Nazis, but among a large proportion of the Austrian population that had long identified as German. Hitler's triumphal drive through his hometown of Braunau am Inn and then into Vienna was greeted by enormous, genuinely enthusiastic crowds. When he stood on the balcony of the Hofburg Palace in Vienna's historic centre to announce that Austria was now part of the German Reich, the roar of the crowd below was the sound of a people that believed, at that moment, that a wrong had been righted. The international reaction confirmed Hitler's assessment of Western weakness. Britain and France protested, but took no action. Mussolini's Italy, which had briefly threatened to intervene when a previous Nazi coup attempt in Austria was crushed in 1934, was now bound to Germany in the Rome-Berlin axis, and made no objection. Hitler's gamble had paid off again, and the strategic position of Germany had improved dramatically at a stroke. The absorption of Austria, spectacular as it was merely the first act of 1938's program of conquest. Czechoslovakia was next, and the Czechoslovak crisis of 1938 provides perhaps the clearest possible illustration of how Hitler's determination to start a war intersected with the Allied powers' desperate desire to avoid one, creating the precise conditions in which appeasement became possible and eventually led to catastrophe. Czechoslovakia was, in many respects, the most successful democracy in Central Europe. Created in 1918 from the wreckage of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, it had a functioning parliamentary government, a strong industrial economy centered on the Skoda arms works, and one of the best-equipped small armies in Europe. It also had a powerful ring of mountain fortifications in the Sudetenland, the border region that contained a majority ethnic German population of over 3 million people. These fortifications were specifically designed to resist a German invasion, and German military planners regarded them with profound respect, estimating that their capture would cost tens of thousands of German casualties. But Czechoslovakia also had a fatal vulnerability. The Sudetenland Germans, deliberately stirred up by the Nazi-funded Sudetendeutsche Partei of Konrad Henlein, were presenting a ready-made pretext for German intervention. Hitler's strategy toward Czechoslovakia was deliberately two-tracked. Publicly, he proclaimed that all he wanted was the self-determination of the Sudeten Germans, that they should be allowed to join the German Reich if they wished, just as the Austrians had. Privately, in a series of top-secret directives beginning in May 1938 with Case Green, he ordered the Wehrmacht to prepare for the military destruction of Czechoslovakia, with a target date of October 1st, 1938. The purpose was not to liberate the Sudetenlanders. They were, as Hitler privately told his generals, merely a pretext. The purpose was to destroy the Czech state entirely, seize its industrial resources, and use Czechoslovakia's territory as a base for the next phase of eastern expansion. The Sudetenland fortifications could be bypassed if Czechoslovakia were compelled to surrender them without fighting, and that is precisely what happened at Munich. The Munich Agreement of September 29th to 30th, 1938, at which British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, French Prime Minister Édouard Daladier, Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, and Adolf Hitler agreed to the transfer of the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia to Germany, is one of the most debated episodes in the history of the Second World War, and for good reason. To its defenders, it represented a genuine and understandable effort to prevent war in circumstances where public opinion in Britain and France was overwhelmingly opposed to fighting over Czechoslovakia, where both countries were not yet rearmed to the levels they believed necessary, and where the moral argument that the Sudeten Germans deserved self-determination just as other peoples did had a genuine logic. To its critics, it was a moral catastrophe and a strategic disaster, the surrender of a democratic ally to naked aggression, and the gift of Czechoslovakia's formidable military resources to Germany. Chamberlain returned to London waving a piece of paper on which Hitler had promised that he harboured no further territorial demands in Europe. He proclaimed that he had achieved peace with honour and peace for our time. Within 6 months, Hitler had swallowed the rest of Czechoslovakia and demonstrated beyond any remaining doubt that his promises were worthless and that his ambitions were not limited to the incorporation of ethnic Germans into the Reich, but encompassed the conquest and subjugation of entire non-German peoples. The occupation of the remainder of Czechoslovakia on March 15, 1939, was a watershed. By marching into Prague and establishing the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, Hitler had destroyed in a single stroke the entire framework of appeasement. The Sudeten Germans could have been accommodated within a principle of national self-determination, however cynically that principle had been invoked. But Czechs were not Germans. Bohemia and Moravia had no ethnic German majority. There was no pretense of self-determination available. Hitler had simply taken a sovereign non-German country by force in brazen violation of the Munich Agreement signed just 6 months before. The effect on British and French public opinion was galvanizing. The policy of appeasement was comprehensively discredited overnight. Chamberlain, who had placed his personal reputation on the line for the Munich Agreement, felt personally betrayed and humiliated. Within days, Britain and France issued guarantees of military assistance to Poland, Romania, and Greece. For the first time since Hitler had come to power, the Western democracies had drawn a line and declared that they would fight to defend it. But did these guarantees deter Hitler? The remarkable and, in retrospect, terrifying answer is that they did not. Hitler's response to the British and French guarantees to Poland was not to pause and reconsider, not to recalculate the strategic risks, but to accelerate his planning. Within days of Chamberlain's guarantee to Poland on March 31, 1939, Hitler had signed a secret directive ordering the Wehrmacht to prepare for the invasion of Poland with a target date of September 1, 1939. His contempt for the guarantee was total. He dismissed Chamberlain as a little worm and expressed his certainty that Britain and France would not fight for Poland any more than they had fought for Czechoslovakia. He was almost right, and he would have been entirely right if not for the extraordinary sequence of events of September 1939 that forced the Chamberlain government to honour its commitment. To understand why Hitler was so confident that he could invade Poland without triggering a general European war, and to understand the most brilliant, unexpected, and ultimately fatal diplomatic coup of his pre-war career, we must examine the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, signed in Moscow on August 23, 1939. The pact was announced to a stunned world less than 2 weeks before the invasion of Poland, and its shock value was enormous. For years, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union had been ideological enemies, their propaganda systems dedicated to mutual demonization. Hitler's Germany portrayed Bolshevism as a Jewish-directed conspiracy against Western civilization. Stalin's Soviet Union portrayed fascism as the last desperate weapon of dying capitalism. The two systems seemed completely incompatible. The idea of a deal between them seemed almost inconceivable. And yet, there it was, signed by Joachim von Ribbentrop for Germany and Vyacheslav Molotov for the Soviet Union, a formal non-aggression pact accompanied by a secret protocol that divided Eastern Europe into Soviet and German spheres of influence. Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Eastern Poland would go to the Soviet sphere. Lithuania, later revised, and Western Poland would fall to Germany. A fourth partition of Poland was agreed before the first German soldier had crossed the Polish border. For Hitler, the pact solved what had always been Germany's greatest strategic vulnerability, the risk of a two-front war. The nightmare of 1914, when Germany had been forced to fight simultaneously against France in the west and Russia in the east, dividing its forces and ultimately exhausting its capacity, had been a central concern of German strategic planning for decades. With the Soviet Union neutralized by the Non-Aggression Pact, Germany could deal with Poland and the Western powers with undivided attention before eventually turning east. Stalin, for his part, appears to have believed that the pact bought him time to complete Soviet rearmament before the inevitable clash with Germany. He was catastrophically wrong about Hitler's timetable, but that is a story that belongs to June 1941. What matters for the question of why Hitler started the war in September 1939 is that the pact removed the last significant strategic obstacle to the invasion of Poland. Hitler had maneuvered himself into a position where he could strike Poland while keeping the Soviet Union neutral, and he was still betting that Britain and France would not honor their guarantee. He was gambling, as he had gambled successfully so many times before, that the Western powers would flinch at the last moment. The role of the Western powers' appeasement policy in creating the conditions for war deserves close examination, because it is one of the most controversial and consequential elements of the entire pre-war story. The policy of appeasement, as practiced by British governments from Ramsay, MacDonald through Stanley Baldwin to Neville Chamberlain, was not simply cowardice or naivety, though it contained elements of both. It was rooted in several genuine and complex considerations that made it appear, at least initially, as a rational response to a dangerous situation. First, there was the memory of the First World War, which had killed nearly 1 million British soldiers and scarred an entire generation. British public opinion in the 1930s was profoundly, almost pathologically, pacifist. The Oxford Union had passed its famous resolution in 1933 that this House will in no circumstances fight for its king and country. Peace pledge unions attracted millions of signatures. When the government conducted a private survey of public opinion in 1934, it discovered that the vast majority of respondents opposed any use of force to enforce international law. Any British government that wanted to take a hard line against German aggression faced the prospect of being voted out of office by an electorate that simply did not want to fight. Second, many influential British politicians, businessmen and aristocrats were genuinely sympathetic to some of Germany's grievances. The Versailles Treaty had been widely criticised in Britain even in 1919, and the revisionist argument that Germany had been treated too harshly and that the instability of Central Europe was partly the result of unfair peace terms had broad support across the political spectrum. The idea of allowing Germany to absorb Austria and the Sudeten Germans seemed to many British observers not a capitulation to aggression, but a belated rectification of Versailles injustices. This argument had a seductive logic. If self-determination was a genuine principle, then Germans deserved it as much as Poles or Czechs. The fact that Hitler was using the principle cynically as a pretext was less obvious to contemporaries than it appears to us in retrospect. Third, Britain was not ready for war. The British Army in 1938 could have fielded only 2 divisions for deployment on the continent, a fraction of the force required to make any difference against the Wehrmacht. The Royal Air Force was in the middle of a major expansion program but had not yet received the Hurricanes and Spitfires that would win the Battle of Britain. The Navy was powerful but could not project that power onto the European continent. British rearmament did not reach full capacity until 1940 and 1941. The Munich Agreement gave Britain and France 1 additional year to rearm, and that year turned out to be crucial for the survival of Britain. And yet, appeasement failed for a fundamental reason that its architects refused to acknowledge until it was almost too late. Appeasement assumed that Hitler was a rational statesman with limited and definable goals, that if his legitimate grievances were addressed, he would be satisfied and become a responsible member of the international order. This was precisely wrong. Hitler was not a revisionist statesman seeking to restore German dignity and security within an adjusted European order. He was a revolutionary with an ideological program that required the conquest and racial reorganization of the entire European continent. There was no final territorial demand that he would state and honor. The Sudetenland was not his last demand, as he had privately made clear months before Chamberlain flew to Munich. Bohemia and Moravia were not his last demand either. Danzig was not his last demand. Poland was not his last demand. The Soviet Union itself was not his last demand. His program was totalizing and could not be satisfied by any conceivable concession, because its goal was not the satisfaction of specific grievances, but the transformation of the entire European and eventually global order on racial principles. The British and French governments were, in effect, attempting to negotiate with someone who was not interested in negotiating a settlement, but in waiting for the moment when settlement was no longer necessary, because Germany was strong enough to take everything by force. Hitler's psychological makeup was itself one of the reasons the war happened when it did, and in the form it took. By the late 1930s, Hitler was increasingly obsessed with his own mortality and the fear that he would not live long enough to complete his program. He was born in 1889, which meant he was 50 years old when the war began. He was convinced, without very good medical evidence, that he had serious health problems and might not live many more years. He smoked, he ate poorly, he took a cocktail of medications administered by his quack physician, Theodor Morell. He suffered from various gastrointestinal complaints that may have had a significant psychological component, and he was haunted by the examples of his father and his mother, both of whom had died relatively young. Several of his closest associates recorded his statements that he would not live forever, and that Germany's program could not wait for the convenience of history. At a private meeting with his military commanders on August 22, 1939, just days before the invasion of Poland, Hitler reportedly said that Germany's fate depended on him personally, that he alone had the strength and the will to drive the program forward, and that there was no time to lose. This was not merely the narcissism of a dictator. It was a genuine strategic calculation. If Germany waited to achieve overwhelming superiority before striking, the window of opportunity might close. The Western powers were rearming. The Soviet Union was rebuilding its military after the devastation of Stalin's purges. Time was running out for the window of German military advantage. Better to strike now with the forces available than to wait for a theoretical perfection that might never arrive. There is one more reason, less ideological and more brutally pragmatic, that historians have identified as a driver of Hitler's decision for war: the economic necessity of plunder. The German rearmament program had been financed largely by deficit spending, by Hjalmarschacht's clever financial instruments known as MIFO bills, and by the plunder of Jewish-owned property after the introduction of the Nuremberg laws, and especially after the Kristallnacht pogrom of November 1938. But by 1939, these resources were running thin. Germany lacked the foreign exchange to pay for imported raw materials. The gold and currency reserves seized from Austria after the Anschluss had provided a temporary windfall, and the seizure of Czechoslovakia's gold reserves and the Skoda arms works had added more. But these were one-time gains. The logic of the Nazi economic system pointed inexorably toward permanent, large-scale plunder of conquered territories as the only way to sustain the war economy indefinitely. War was not merely the instrument of ideological and racial goals. It was also the mechanism by which the Nazi economic model could be kept running. Each conquest brought new plundered wealth, new slave labour, new raw materials, and new financial resources that could finance the next conquest. This predatory economic logic was not the primary driver of Nazi expansionism, but it reinforced and intensified the ideological imperatives at every stage. The Polish question that dominated the final months of peace is one of the most studied and debated episodes in the entire pre-war crisis, and it reveals with unusual clarity the interplay between Hitler's strategic planning, his ideological commitments, and his almost contemptuous confidence that he could manage the diplomatic consequences of any military action he chose to take. Poland had been resurrected as an independent state in 1918, after a century and a quarter of partition between Russia, Prussia, and Austria, and the circumstances of its resurrection had left it with the most contested borders of any country in Europe. The Polish corridor, that strip of territory giving Poland access to the Baltic Sea and separating East Prussia from the rest of Germany, was a geographical irritant that every German government from Weimar through to the Third Reich had regarded as intolerable. The Free City of Danzig, a predominantly German city placed under League of Nations protection but economically tied to Poland, had been a source of endless friction since 1919. And Polish-German relations had been further complicated by the large German minorities in western Poland, particularly in the Poznan region, who had suffered considerable discrimination under Polish administration. Hitler had actually shown more pragmatism toward Poland than toward most other neighbouring states during the early years of his regime. In January 1934, Germany and Poland had signed a non-aggression pact, a 10-year declaration that both countries would resolve their disputes peacefully. Hitler's calculation at the time was that a stable relationship with Poland would help isolate France by removing one potential ally. For 5 years, the relationship had been managed, if not warm. Polish Foreign Minister Józef Beck had pursued a policy of balance between Germany and the Soviet Union, maintaining relations with both great powers while trying to preserve Polish independence between them. But by early 1939, Hitler had decided that Poland's moment had come. In March 1939, he issued a series of demands. Danzig must be returned to Germany, and Germany must be granted an extraterritorial road and rail connection across the Polish corridor to East Prussia. These were not, by themselves, unreasonable demands in a strictly geographical sense. Danzig was indeed German-speaking, and its formal political separation from Germany was an anomaly. The corridor demand was a genuine strategic inconvenience, but they were demands delivered in the context of what had just happened in Czechoslovakia, just days before Germany marched into Prague, and the Polish government correctly understood them not as the opening of a negotiation, but as the beginning of a program of coercion that, if accepted, would make Poland a German satellite and then a German target. Beck refused. He understood that conceding to Hitler's demands on Danzig and the corridor would not satisfy Hitler, but would simply encourage further demands until Poland was reduced to the status of a client state like Hungary or Romania. He also understood correctly that Hitler's real objective was not Danzig, but the destruction of Polish independence and the absorption of Poland's territory into the German Empire of Lebensraum. Poland refused to negotiate under duress, refused to grant the corridor demand, and when the British guarantee arrived on March 31, 1939, the Poles accepted it as the foundation of a mutual defence pact signed in late August. For Hitler, this refusal was a personal affront as well as a strategic obstacle. He expected that Poland, recognising German power, would submit as Austria had submitted and as Czechoslovakia had eventually submitted. Instead, Poland had the temerity to say no and to seek the backing of the very powers whose will to fight Hitler had consistently underestimated. His response was to accelerate planning for the military destruction of Poland and to dismiss the possibility of British and French intervention with increasing impatience. But were Hitler's military preparations for the Polish campaign actually ready? The honest answer is that they were barely adequate, and this relative weakness was another reason why 1939, rather than a later year, was the year Hitler chose. The Wehrmacht of 1939 was powerful, but not yet the supreme military instrument it would become by 1941. Germany had 58 divisions available for the Polish campaign, but most were understrength and many were equipped with older weapons. The German tank force, while innovative in its tactics and doctrine, was equipped largely with the light Panzer I and II models that were outclassed by French and even Polish armour in terms of individual vehicle capability. The Luftwaffe was powerful and modern, but had limited range and was dependent on local air superiority. The German army's logistics system was stretched. More fundamentally, German military planners knew that if France attacked in the west while Germany was engaged in Poland, the Western Front could not hold for long. The French army was, in September 1939, significantly larger than Germany's western covering force. If France had launched a serious offensive while the bulk of the Wehrmacht was in Poland, the consequences could have been severe. Germany was gambling that France would not attack, and France did not attack. The French launched a token offensive, the Saar Offensive, in mid-September 1939, advancing a few kilometers into the German Saar region before halting and eventually withdrawing. This extraordinary caution by the Allied forces, which had Poland's survival in their hands, is one of the great might-have-beens of the Second World War. Why didn't France and Britain do more? Part of the answer is psychological and diplomatic. Both countries had just completed the transformation from appeasement to confrontation and had not fully committed emotionally or militarily to the idea of actually fighting. Part of the answer is strategic. The French military doctrine of the 1930s, shaped by the traumatic memories of the First World War, was fundamentally defensive. The Maginot Line, the elaborate fortification system that France had built along its border with Germany at enormous expense during the 1930s, was a physical expression of a mental attitude. France would defend, but not attack. The British Expeditionary Force was only just beginning to deploy to France and was far too small and under-equipped to mount offensive operations. And part of the answer is simply that both governments still hoped, at some level, that a diplomatic solution might be found even after the shooting had started, that perhaps Mussolini could mediate, that perhaps Hitler would accept some face-saving formula. There was no such formula. There was no such willingness on Hitler's part. Germany was already deep into Poland when Chamberlain made his declaration of war on September 3, 1939, and the question was no longer whether Poland could be saved, but only whether Germany could be stopped. The Polish campaign itself lasted just over 5 weeks, from September 1st to October 6, 1939, when the last Polish resistance ceased. It demonstrated, to those who were paying attention, the revolutionary nature of the German military doctrine that would become famous as Blitzkrieg. Rather than the slow, methodical advance that had characterized the First World War, the Wehrmacht moved with blinding speed, using armored columns to penetrate deep behind Polish lines, encircling large Polish formations before they could respond, and using the Luftwaffe to destroy Polish communications, airfields, and concentration points. Warsaw was surrounded and bombed into submission. The Polish government and army command fled toward Romania, and on September 17th, the Soviet Red Army invaded from the east, in accordance with the secret protocol of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, sealing Poland's fate from 2 directions simultaneously. Poland's resistance was brave but overwhelmed by the convergence of the Wehrmacht from the west, north, and south, and the Red Army from the east against a country that had received no meaningful military assistance from its western guarantors. The fall of Poland is the official beginning of the Second World War, but it is important to understand that for Hitler, September 1st, 1939 was not the beginning of the war he had planned. It was a partial, incomplete, and in many ways unsatisfactory opening move in a much larger design. He had hoped and expected that Britain and France would not declare war, that they would accept Poland's destruction as they had accepted Austria's and Czechoslovakia's, and that Germany could then turn its full attention to the Great Eastern Campaign at a time of its choosing. Instead, he had a two-front war, precisely the situation Germany's strategic planners had always feared. Britain and France had declared war. They were not fighting actively, but they were committed to fighting. Germany had conquered Poland, but it had done so at the cost of triggering the very Western confrontation that Hitler had hoped to avoid, at least until Germany was stronger. The war that actually began in September 1939 was not the war Hitler had planned. It was a smaller, earlier version of it, made necessary by Poland's refusal to submit and by the British and French guarantees that gave Poland enough diplomatic backing to refuse. Hitler was improvising, as he often had before, and as before, his improvisations produced remarkable short-term successes that masked their long-term contradictions. The role of the German military establishment in enabling the road to war is an aspect of the story that has sometimes been obscured by the post-war efforts of surviving German generals to present themselves as reluctant instruments of Hitler's will who disapproved of his reckless policies and had no choice but to follow orders. The reality was considerably more complex. It is true that a significant number of senior German officers harboured doubts about Hitler's military timetable and feared that Germany was not yet strong enough for a major war. The conspiracies and plots that eventually led to the July 20th, 1944 assassination attempt on Hitler were rooted in genuine opposition within the officer corps to Hitler's leadership. In 1938, a group of senior generals had actually planned a coup to arrest Hitler if he ordered the invasion of Czechoslovakia, a plan that was overtaken by events when the Munich Agreement removed the immediate pretext for action. General Ludwig Beck, chief of the General Staff, resigned in protest over Hitler's war plans in August 1938, the only senior German general to do so in the entire pre-war period. But for every Beck who resigned, there were dozens of Keitels who complied, dozens of officers who believed Hitler's early successes justified their obedience, or who feared the consequences of refusal, or who shared enough of Hitler's nationalist and anti-Versailles sentiments to regard the restoration of German military power as a good in itself, even if they had reservations about the pace and methods. The German officer corps was not a captive instrument of Hitler's will from the start, but it became one, step by step, as each successful gamble made it harder to argue that Hitler's judgment was worse than theirs, and as the personal oath of loyalty became an increasingly heavy constraint on individual conscience. The relationship between German industry and the Nazi rearmament program is another essential element of the structural reasons for war. German heavy industry, the great steel, chemical and mining conglomerates of the Ruhr and Rhineland, had supported the Nazis financially from the early 1930s and had enthusiastically embraced the rearmament contracts that flowed from the four-year plan. Companies like Krupp, IG Farben, Thyssen and Flick grew enormously fat on Wehrmacht contracts, and their leaders understood, at some level, that the rearmament they were supplying was aimed at war. Alfred Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach, whose family firm was the preeminent German armaments manufacturer, was deeply involved in planning the rearmament program from its earlier stages. The chemical giant IG Farben produced the synthetic fuels and synthetic rubber that the Wehrmacht needed for mobile warfare. The management of these companies was not dragooned into supporting the Nazi state. Many of them were genuine ideological allies who shared Hitler's anti-communism, his contempt for the labor movement, and his vision of Germany as a great power exercising dominance over a European empire. They were, in the terminology that would become famous at Nuremberg, willing participants in the preparations for aggressive war. The question of the German public's knowledge of and attitude toward the prospect of war is one that historians have examined with increasing sophistication in recent decades. The picture that emerges is more complex than either the wartime Allied narrative of a nation of enthusiastic warmongers or the post-war German narrative of a people who were the victims of an elite conspiracy to which they were largely oblivious. The German public in 1939 was not overwhelmingly enthusiastic about war. The newsreel footage and press photographs showing crowds cheering at the proclamation of war on September 1st, 1939, reflected, to some extent, a genuine surge of patriotic feeling. But security services reports, diary entries and diplomatic observations from neutral countries all suggest that the dominant mood in Germany on the eve of war was something between resigned acceptance and anxious apprehension rather than the joyful anticipation of 1914. Germans in 1939 knew, or at least feared, that this war would be harder and longer than Hitler's rapid diplomatic and military successes of the preceding years. the memory of the First World War, with its 4 years of privation, mass death, and eventual defeat, was only 20 years old. The generation that had fought in the trenches was in its 40s and 50s, still alive, still present, still capable of remembering. What had silenced public doubts and generated the acquiescence that the Nazi regime needed was not primarily enthusiastic support for Hitler's war aims, but a combination of factors that are worth itemizing carefully because they tell us a great deal about how totalitarian systems generate the appearance of consent. First, the economic recovery. Whatever else one thought about Hitler, the years from 1933 to 1939 had seen the transformation of Germany from a country with 6 million unemployed in the depths of the Depression to a country with virtually full employment, rising living standards, new highways and public buildings, and a sense of national pride and purpose that had been entirely absent from the humiliated Weimar years. Germans who had watched their savings wiped out by inflation and their jobs destroyed by the Depression now had work, income, and stability. This created a reservoir of gratitude and goodwill toward the regime that survived considerable subsequent evidence of its criminal character. Second, the propaganda. Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda and Public Enlightenment was one of the most sophisticated manipulation machines ever devised, controlling every channel of communication available to the German public, from newspapers and radio to film and the arts, and deploying that control to create a comprehensive alternative reality in which Germany was always the victim, never the aggressor, and Hitler was always the wise, selfless leader, sacrificing himself for his people. Third, the terror. The Gestapo, despite being smaller than its totalitarian reputation suggests, created through a combination of real surveillance, denunciation networks, and carefully publicized punishments, a climate of fear in which public dissent was genuinely dangerous. People who had private doubts kept them private, creating the illusion of uniform support for the regime. The night of November 9th to 10th, 1938, known as Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, offers a window into the relationship between Hitler's ideological program and the German public's response to it, and it is a window that complicates any simple narrative in either direction. The pogroms, organized by the SS and SA under Goebbels' direction following the assassination of a German diplomat in Paris by a young Jewish man driven to desperation by the deportation of his family, destroyed thousands of Jewish-owned businesses and synagogues across Germany and Austria, left nearly 100 Jews dead in the immediate violence, and resulted in the arrest and brutal treatment of approximately 30,000 Jewish men sent to concentration camps. The scale of the violence shocked many Germans, including some within the Nazi Party itself. Foreign diplomatic observers noted widespread expressions of disgust among ordinary Germans, who had not expected or wanted this level of physical destruction in their own streets. Goering was furious about the economic damage, the broken glass alone representing the destruction of glass reserves worth millions of Reichsmarks. But the international outrage, which was substantial, was met by the German government with defiant indifference, and the economic penalties imposed on the Jewish community, including a collective fine of 1 billion Reichsmarks, indicated that Hitler viewed the pogrom as an opportunity to accelerate the dispossession of German Jews, regardless of international reaction. What Kristallnacht demonstrated above all was the trajectory of Hitler's Jewish policy. It was moving steadily toward extremity, toward the physical elimination that his ideology had always implied, and no amount of international protest would deflect it. The war that Hitler launched in September 1939 would, within 2 years, create the conditions for the most systematic and comprehensive genocide in human history. Could the war have been prevented? The question haunts every study of the road to September 1939. The historians who have examined this period most carefully have generally concluded that the answer depends on when the question is asked. In 1933, when Hitler came to power, the combination of a firm British and French commitment to the Versailles settlement, backed by credible military force, might have deterred or crippled the Nazi program before it gained momentum. In 1935, when Hitler reintroduced conscription, a clear Allied counter-mobilization might have triggered the domestic political crisis in Germany that the conservative generals who had doubts about Hitler's pace were waiting for. In 1936, when Hitler marched into the Rhineland with forces he himself acknowledged could be repelled by a resolute French response, French military action would almost certainly have ended Hitler's regime and possibly his life. Even in 1938, a firm Anglo-French declaration that any military action against Czechoslovakia would result in immediate war might have given the German generals who were already planning a coup against Hitler the support they needed to act. By 1939, after the moral and strategic capital of the Western democracies had been exhausted at Munich, after Poland had been isolated and then guaranteed but not actually defended, after the Nazi-Soviet pact had removed the Soviet Union from the balancing equation, the war had become extremely difficult to prevent by any means short of complete. Capitulation by Poland to Hitler's demands, which was exactly what Hitler expected and what did not happen. The failure of collective security, the inability of the League of Nations and its member states to develop a credible system of deterrence and collective defense against aggression was as much a reason for the war as any of Hitler's ideological convictions or strategic calculations. The League had been weakened from the start by the United States' refusal to join, by the exclusion of Germany and the Soviet Union in its early years, and by the gap between its ambitious covenant and the very limited willingness of its members to honor its collective security provisions. When Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931 and Italy invaded Abyssinia in 1935, the League's response had been embarrassingly ineffective, demonstrating to anyone paying attention that the international system of collective security was a paper fiction. Hitler paid attention. He understood that the international order of the 1930s would not effectively resist a determined great power, and he was right. The system of international law and collective security that had been constructed at such enormous diplomatic cost after the First World War had not been built with sufficient foundations of military power and political will to withstand a challenger willing to use force. Its failure was not Hitler's doing alone. It was the collective failure of an international community that wanted peace so desperately that it was unwilling to take the necessary steps to defend it, steps that might themselves have involved the risk of conflict. The Weimar Republic's structural weaknesses were another deep-rooted reason why Germany ended up with Hitler and ultimately with war. The republic created in 1919 was Germany's first serious experiment with parliamentary democracy, and it was born under the worst possible circumstances: defeat, revolution, hyperinflation, the stab-in-the-back legend, and the humiliations of Versailles. It had never enjoyed the legitimacy that comes from presiding over national success. It was associated in the public mind with defeat and surrender from the moment of its creation, since it was the Republic's government that had signed the armistice and then the peace treaty. The Weimar Constitution, drafted by distinguished liberal lawyers and theorists, was in many technical respects admirably designed, but it contained several provisions that proved fatal in the conditions of the early 1930s. The system of proportional representation produced a parliament fragmented into dozens of small parties, making stable coalition governments extremely difficult to form and maintain. The emergency powers provision of Article 48, which allowed the president to govern by decree in a national emergency without parliamentary approval, was intended as a temporary measure but became, under Hindenburg in the early 1930s, essentially permanent, normalizing rule by executive decree, and habituating German political culture to governance without parliamentary consent. And the requirement that a chancellor must maintain the confidence of the Reichstag created a situation in which, once the Nazi and Communist parties together held a blocking majority, no stable government was possible through normal parliamentary means. The German Communist Party, the KPD, played a role in Hitler's rise to power that is sometimes overlooked or underemphasized. The KPD, under its leader Ernst Thälmann, and following the Comintern line dictated by Moscow, refused to cooperate with the Social Democrats and other moderate left parties against the Nazi threat, famously describing the Social Democrats as social fascists, meaning that in the Comintern's bizarre political vocabulary, a moderate social democratic party was as dangerous as, or more dangerous than, the actual fascists. This suicidal sectarianism meant that the German left, which together commanded roughly a third of the popular vote, was unable to mount a united front against Hitler in the critical years of 1931 to 1933. The conservative right, meanwhile, was determined to use the Nazis as a vehicle for destroying the left and restoring authoritarian government, without understanding that in Hitler they had chosen an instrument that would eventually consume them too. The result was that Germany in 1932 and 1933 had a large communist threat that alarmed the middle classes and industrialists, a paralyzed parliamentary system, conservative elite committed to destroying democracy, and a Nazi mass movement waiting to step into the resulting vacuum. Hitler did not seize power so much as he was handed it by men who thought they could control him and were catastrophically mistaken. The personal factor in the history of the road to war deserves one more extended examination, because it is easy, in the sweep of structural analysis, to lose sight of how much individual human decisions, particularly one individual's decisions, shaped the course of events. There were at several critical junctures in the 1930s alternatives that might have changed the outcome. If President Hindenburg had refused to appoint Hitler as Chancellor in January 1933, choosing instead a more conventional conservative politician, the Nazi moment might have passed as the Depression lifted and the political crisis eased. If the German generals had carried out their planned coup in 1938, the regime might have fallen before the war began. If Neville Chamberlain had listened to Churchill rather than to his own instincts in the summer of 1938, the Munich Agreement might not have happened. If France had responded militarily to the Rhineland reoccupation in 1936, the course of history would have been fundamentally altered. History is not inevitable. It is the product of choices made by individuals operating under constraints and pressures, but never entirely determined by them. And no individual made more consequential choices in the road to the Second World War than Adolf Hitler himself. What made Hitler uniquely dangerous was the combination of extraordinary political talent with a worldview so radical and comprehensive that it could not be satisfied by any conventional diplomatic settlement. He was a superb political intuitive, with an uncanny ability to sense and exploit the weaknesses of opponents, to identify the issues that resonated with mass audiences, to time his moves for maximum impact, and to project an image of iron certainty that terrified the uncertain. He was also, in the context of the 1930s democratic crisis, a genuinely revolutionary figure who understood that the rules of the liberal international order had been constructed by its beneficiaries and could be broken by anyone with the will to break them. He had seen the major democracies capitulate at Munich. He had seen the League of Nations fail to stop Japan and Italy. He had seen Britain and France accept repeated violations of Versailles with nothing more than protests. He concluded, correctly, that the international system would bend before a sufficiently determined challenger, and he bent it again and again until September 1st, 1939, when it finally refused to bend any further. Hitler's war, when it finally came, was both the logical conclusion of everything he had been working towards since the early 1920s, and a desperate gamble that he was not fully ready to make. It was logical because his entire ideological program had always pointed toward a war of racial expansion in the East, preceded by the elimination of potential Western adversaries. It was a gamble because the conditions in 1939 were not ideal. Germany was not yet at peak military strength, the Soviet Union had not yet been neutralized, and Britain and France had, against his predictions, declared war. But Hitler was always a gambler. A man who trusted his intuition over careful calculation, who believed his will could overcome material obstacles, and who was convinced by a long series of successful bluffs that fortune favoured the bold. He had been proved right so many times that the possibility of being catastrophically wrong seemed to him remote. It would take 5 more years and the deaths of tens of millions of people to prove him wrong. The deeper reasons Hitler had to start World War II, then, were a complex and interlocking web of ideology, personality, history, economics, and strategic calculation. The Treaty of Versailles created the humiliations and grievances that nourished German nationalism. The Dolchstoßlegende provided the fraudulent explanation for defeat that turned those grievances into paranoid conspiracy thinking. The Great Depression destroyed the social and political stability that might have contained German nationalism within democratic forms. Hitler's personal ideological convictions, his racial cosmology, his Lebensraum program, his obsessive anti-Semitism, provided the totalizing framework that transformed German nationalism from a revisionist force into a revolutionary one. The weakness of the Weimar Republic allowed him to come to power. The complicity of German industry and the officer corps provided him the tools of rearmament and conquest. The policy of appeasement by Britain and France gave him the time and space to build those tools and use them. The Nazi-Soviet pact eliminated the immediate strategic threat from the East. Poland's refusal to submit, and the British and French guarantees that backed that refusal, forced the issue to a military conclusion in September 1939. None of these factors alone would have been sufficient to produce the world war that began that September morning when German aircraft began bombing Polish cities and German tanks rolled across the Polish border. Each was necessary, none was sufficient, and it was their coincidence in the specific historical moment of the mid to late 1930s that made the catastrophe possible. But of all the reasons for the war, the most fundamental, the reason without which none of the others would have been decisive, was the existence of Adolf Hitler himself. A man who combined political genius with an ideological program of terrifying radicalism, who used the tools of democracy to destroy democracy, who exploited the legitimate grievances of a humiliated nation to build a movement committed to the conquest and racial reorganization of an entire continent, and who never, from the moment he entered politics in 1919 to the moment he killed himself in the Berlin bunker in April 1945, deviated from the central conviction that Germany must fight, must conquer, and must build a racial empire in the East or perish in the attempt. The Second World War was, in the most essential sense, Hitler's war. It began because he willed it to begin, at a time and in a manner determined by his specific ideological agenda and his specific reading of the strategic situation. To understand why it happened, we must understand him. The role that fear played in Hitler's calculations is perhaps one of the least discussed but most important structural reasons for the timing of the war. Hitler was afraid. Not in the conventional sense that a rational statesman is afraid of military defeat or diplomatic failure, though those fears existed in him too, but in a more fundamental, existential, ideological sense. He was afraid that if Germany did not act, the forces arrayed against it would eventually destroy it. He was afraid of Bolshevism, which he saw as a Jewish-directed extermination campaign against the Aryan race. He was afraid that Germany's brief window of military advantage would close before he had used it. He was afraid that he himself would not live long enough to accomplish what he believed was his historical destiny. He was afraid, above all, of a repetition of 1918, of another German defeat, another November Revolution, another stab in the back. This fear drove him to accelerate, to push harder and faster than a purely rational strategic calculation would have dictated, to take risks that his generals warned against, and that ultimately did prove fatal. The man who started the most destructive war in history was partly motivated by terror, a terror grounded in a paranoid worldview, but experienced by him as completely real and completely justified. The role of the Italian alliance in Hitler's pre-war calculations also deserves attention, because it both emboldened him and ultimately complicated his strategic position in ways he did not fully anticipate. The Rome-Berlin axis, formalized in 1936 and strengthened by the Pact of Steel in May 1939, gave Hitler a significant partner, the only other major European power committed to the destruction of the Versailles Order. Mussolini had, in many respects, pioneered the fascist model that Hitler had adapted and radicalized. The Italian conquest of Abyssinia in 1935 to 1936, conducted in open defiance of the League of Nations and with minimal practical consequences, had further demonstrated the weakness of the collective security system. Mussolini's Italy provided a southern flank for German expansion and tied down significant British and French military attention in the Mediterranean. But the Italian alliance also had significant limitations. Italy's military was substantially weaker than Germany's, its economy was smaller, and its strategic position in the Mediterranean made it vulnerable to British naval power. Mussolini was also an independent operator with his own agenda, not a reliable instrument of German policy. When Hitler launched the invasion of Poland in September 1939, Mussolini, who had not been consulted, declared Italy non-belligerent rather than joining the war immediately, citing Italy's lack of military preparedness. The Pact of Steel had included a provision against either party going to war without consulting the other, a provision Hitler simply ignored. The Italian alliance, for all its symbolic value, was more of a diplomatic prop than a genuine military guarantee, and Hitler may have allowed it to colour his assessment of the coalition he could assemble more optimistically than the facts warranted. When we examine the role of propaganda in preparing Germany for war, we see one of the most technically sophisticated and ultimately destructive applications of mass communication in human history. Goebbels's propaganda ministry, established in March 1933, had total control over every medium of communication available to the German public: newspapers, radio, cinema, theatre, music, the visual arts, architecture, and increasingly the educational system. By 1939, Germany had the highest radio ownership rate of any country in Europe, partly because the government had subsidized the production of the Volksempfänger, the people's receiver, a cheap radio set that could receive German broadcasts but not foreign ones. The Volksempfänger was a deliberate instrument of propaganda, ensuring that millions of Germans who could not afford a full radio set could still be reached by Goebbels' messages while being cut off from the BBC Radio Moscow and other foreign voices that might have provided alternative perspectives. The cinema was similarly controlled, with every film program preceded by newsreels produced by the state propaganda apparatus that presented a carefully curated version of events designed to build support for the regime, celebrate German military power, demonize Germany's enemies, and prepare the audience psychologically for the wars that were coming. The particular genius of Nazi propaganda was that it did not rely primarily on explicit political instruction. It worked instead through the creation of atmosphere, through spectacle, through emotional manipulation, through the constant repetition of key themes and images until they became unquestioned background assumptions rather than conscious beliefs. The vast Nuremberg rallies, those carefully choreographed theatrical events with their torchlit processions, their synchronized columns, their cathedral of light effects produced by hundreds of searchlights pointing skyward, were not merely demonstrations of mass support. They were instruments of psychological transformation, designed to make individual participants feel part of something vast, certain, and irresistible, to dissolve the individual conscience in the collective emotion of national awakening. Leni Riefenstahl's documentary films of the rallies, particularly Triumph of the Will from 1935, created images of Nazi power so aesthetically powerful that they have retained their disturbing capacity to impress even when watched by viewers who understand perfectly well what they represented. The propaganda did not create Germans' grievances or desires, but it shaped, directed, and intensified them in ways that made the population more susceptible to the call to war. One of the most important and underappreciated reasons why Hitler was able to start the war in 1939 was the successful suppression of the internal German opposition that might otherwise have stopped him. The Germany of the 1930s was not, as it is sometimes imagined, a country of uniformly enthusiastic Nazis. There were millions of Germans who had voted for the Social Democrats, the Communists, or the Catholic Centre Party, and who never gave the Nazis their votes. There were hundreds of thousands of members of trade unions, churches, and civic organizations that had tried to maintain their independence from the Nazi state. There were military officers, as we have seen, who harbored doubts about Hitler's pace and methods. There were conservative aristocrats and industrialists who had supported the Nazis as a useful anti-communist tool, but were alarmed by the scale of the monster they had created. There were civil servants, judges, and academics who retained professional standards and personal decencies that conflicted with the regime's demands. And there were, above all, hundreds of thousands of German Jews, political dissidents, and other targets of Nazi persecution who understood perfectly well what the regime was and fought its demands at the price of imprisonment, exile, or death. None of these groups succeeded in stopping Hitler, and the reasons why they failed are instructive. The physical terror of the SS, Gestapo, and concentration camp system was genuinely frightening and effectively suppressed organised opposition. The legal system was corrupted from within, with Nazi-appointed judges applying Nazi law. The Communist Party was destroyed in 1933 by the Reichstag fire decree before it could organise resistance. The Social Democrats were banned and their leaders arrested or driven into exile. The trade unions were dissolved. The churches made their various accommodations with the regime. The Protestant churches generally more thoroughly than the Catholic Church, with heroic individual exceptions in both. The conservative opposition, which mounted the July 20th, 1944 assassination attempt and the various earlier conspiracy plots, was undermined by its own internal divisions, by the personal loyalty oath, and by the remarkable political skill with which Hitler navigated the early crises of his regime, delivering the successes in foreign policy and economic recovery that made sustained opposition very difficult to maintain. By the time the regime's criminal character was fully apparent, the apparatus of repression was too powerful and pervasive to be challenged from within without outside military defeat. And that defeat, when it eventually came, required the deaths of tens of millions. The question of what specifically triggered the final decision for war in the summer of 1939 is one that historians have examined with great care. And the answer reveals the extent to which Hitler was not merely responding to circumstances, but actively managing a crisis he had largely created. In April 1939, following the occupation of the rest of Czechoslovakia and the British guarantee to Poland, Hitler signed the directive for Case White, the operational plan for the invasion of Poland. He set a provisional date of September 1, 1939 for the commencement of operations, and he communicated to his military commanders the fundamental strategic assumption on which the operation rested, that Britain and France would not fight. He was aware of the risk that he was wrong, but he assessed it as acceptable, and he invested enormous diplomatic energy in the summer of 1939 in trying to reinforce his assessment. The negotiations that led to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact were the most important element of this diplomatic preparation. By securing Soviet neutrality, Hitler removed what he regarded as the one factor that might make Britain and France more confident about confronting Germany: the availability of a powerful Eastern ally. Without the Soviet Union, a Western military intervention to relieve Poland would require the Western powers to sustain a prolonged military campaign against a Germany fighting on a single front, and Hitler doubted they had the stomach for it. Throughout July and August 1939, as the diplomatic crisis over Poland intensified, Hitler received a stream of messages from his ambassador in London, Herbert von Dirksen, and from other sources that suggested Britain was looking for a way to avoid war. There were back-channel contacts between British and German officials. There were suggestions from various intermediaries that a compromise might be found. There were signals from Chamberlain's government that Britain did not want to fight and might accept a negotiated solution if one could be found that did not involve Germany's complete capitulation. Hitler interpreted these signals, with considerable justification, as evidence that Britain was fundamentally irresolute and would not follow through on its guarantee. He was partly right and partly wrong. Chamberlain did indeed want desperately to avoid war, and right up to the final days of August 1939 he was exploring any diplomatic route that might provide a face-saving exit. But the British government had by August 1939 reached the conclusion that surrender to Hitler's demands would be worse than war, and when the German army crossed the Polish border on September 1, 1939, Chamberlain had no choice but to honour the guarantee. The policy of appeasement had finally run out of road. The moment of September 1, 1939, 4:45. In the morning, when German forces crossed the Polish frontier and the battleship Schleswig-Holstein opened fire on the Polish fortress at Westerplatte in the Danzig harbour, was the culmination of everything we have examined. It was the product of the Treaty of Versailles and the humiliations it had imposed. It was the product of the Dolchstoßlegende and the paranoid nationalist mythology it had generated. It was the product of the Great Depression and the political crisis it had created in Germany. It was the product of Hitler's personal ideology, his racial cosmology, his Lebensraum program, his absolute conviction that the German people were in a life-or-death struggle with their enemies. It was the product of his rise to power through the exploitation of democratic mechanisms, followed by the destruction of democracy itself. It was the product of his step-by-step dismantling of the Versailles settlement in the face of Western acquiescence. It was the product of his successful rearmament of Germany, his remilitarization of the Rhineland, his absorption of Austria, his destruction of Czechoslovakia. It was the product of the Nazi-Soviet pact and the diplomatic isolation of Poland it achieved. And it was the product of Poland's refusal to submit, and Britain's and France's eventual decision that they could no longer acquiesce in Hitler's program of conquest. All of these factors converged in that grey September morning to produce the moment that would define the 20th century. What happened in the weeks after September 1st, 1939, confirmed that the war Hitler had started was going to be larger, longer, and more devastating than even the most pessimistic observers had imagined. Poland fell in 5 weeks, but Britain and France did not make peace. The phony war, that strange period of formal belligerence without active fighting on the Western Front between September 1939 and May 1940, gave Hitler the time he needed to reorganize his forces, absorb the strategic lessons of the Polish campaign, and prepare for the decisive Western offensive. In April 1940, Germany invaded Denmark and Norway, securing the northern flank and its iron ore imports from Scandinavia. On May 10, 1940, the Great Western Offensive began. The Wehrmacht broke through the Ardennes, outflanking the Maginot Line and the Allied forces that had advanced into Belgium to meet what they thought was the main German attack. Within 6 weeks, France had fallen. The British Expeditionary Force had been evacuated at Dunkirk, leaving virtually all its heavy equipment behind. The Western Front had collapsed with a speed that astonished the world, including Hitler and his own generals. The man who had gambled on Western weakness had been proved right, at least in the short term. But the very success of the Western campaign planted the seeds of Germany's ultimate defeat, because it encouraged in Hitler a dangerous overconfidence that led him to his greatest blunder: the invasion of the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941. Operation Barbarossa, the largest military operation in human history, was the war Hitler had always wanted to fight, the war that lay at the ideological heart of his entire program. It was the war for Lebensraum, the war against Jewish Bolshevism, the war that would create the continental empire from which German supremacy would be maintained for 1,000 years. But it was also the war that would ultimately destroy him and the movement he had created. The Soviet Union did not collapse as he had predicted. The Red Army did not crumble at the first German blow. Stalin did not flee. The Soviet people did not rise against their government and welcome the Germans as liberators. Instead, the Soviets absorbed the initial devastating losses, reorganized, mobilized the vast resources of a continental empire, and began the grinding, 3-year-long process of turning the tide. At Stalingrad, in the winter of 1942 to 1943, the Sixth Army under Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus was encircled and destroyed. The first great German strategic defeat of the war, and the turning point that Hitler had refused to believe could happen. After Stalingrad, the strategic initiative passed to the Soviets, and it never returned to German hands. The United States entered the war in December 1941, following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and Hitler's extraordinary decision to declare war on America 3 days later, a decision that remains one of the most puzzling and consequential of his career. Germany was under no treaty obligation to declare war on the United States. The tripartite pact with Japan required Germany to come to Japan's assistance if Japan were attacked, not if Japan attacked someone else. Hitler may have believed that the United States would enter the war against Germany anyway, as it had in 1917, and that by declaring war first, he would at least gain the initiative. He may have been motivated by his contempt for American military capability and his calculation that America's industrial potential, while formidable on paper, could not be mobilized quickly enough to affect the European war's outcome. He may have been in the grip of an ideological conviction that the United States was a mongrel nation whose Jewish overlords were already directing it against Germany in everything but name. Whatever his reasoning, the declaration of war on the United States brought the world's largest industrial economy fully into the conflict against Germany and made German defeat, in retrospect, only a matter of time, and at what cost. The Holocaust, the systematic murder of 6 million European Jews and millions of others, including Romani people, Soviet prisoners of war, people with disabilities, homosexuals, and political opponents, was, in many respects, the fullest expression of the ideological program that had driven Hitler to start the war in the first place. The decision to move from persecution and expulsion to systematic mass murder was taken in stages between 1941 and 1942, enabled by the conquest of large Jewish populations in occupied Poland and the Soviet Union, and by the secrecy and bureaucratic machinery that the Nazi state had developed over 8 years of totalitarian governance. The Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units that followed the Wehrmacht into the Soviet Union, murdered over 1 million Jews in mass shootings at sites like Babi Yar near Kiev in September 1941, where 33,000 Jews were shot in 2 days. The Wannsee Conference of January 20, 1942, coordinated the bureaucratic apparatus for the final solution, the industrialized murder of European Jewry through the extermination camps established at Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chelmno, and Majdanek. These camps and the system they represented were the logical conclusion of the racial ideology that had been at the core of Hitler's worldview since the Vienna years, and they were made possible by the war he had started. Without the war, without the conquest of Poland and the Soviet Union and their large Jewish populations, without the cover of total war that provided both the bureaucratic capacity and the geographic isolation for mass murder on this scale, the Holocaust as it actually occurred could not have happened. The connection between Hitler's decision to start the war and the genocide that followed is not incidental or contingent. It is structural, ideological and direct. The legacy of the war Hitler started is still with us, in ways both obvious and subtle. The physical destruction of Europe, the 70 million dead, the tens of millions displaced, the cities reduced to rubble, the industrial and agricultural infrastructure destroyed, all of this required decades to rebuild and left permanent marks on the societies that experienced it. The political map of Europe was redrawn along lines that persisted for half a century. With Germany divided, Eastern Europe under Soviet domination, and the Western European nations bound together in an unprecedented experiment in supranational integration, partly driven by the determination to make another European war impossible. The United Nations, established in 1945 as a replacement for the failed League, embodied the lesson that collective security required genuine commitment and real military capacity, not merely paper resolutions. The Nuremberg trials established the principle that crimes against humanity and aggressive war were prosecutable offences under international law, that heads of state and military commanders could not hide behind the defence of following orders, and that individuals bore personal moral and legal responsibility for their actions, regardless of the commands they had received. These were revolutionary principles in international law, and they owe their existence to the scale of the crime that made them necessary. The question of how an advanced, educated, and culturally sophisticated society came to embrace a movement as brutal and totalitarian as Nazism remains one of the most pressing intellectual and moral questions of the modern era. Germany in 1933 was not a backward or particularly violent society. It was one of the world leaders in science, philosophy, music, literature, and the arts. Its universities produced Nobel laureates. Its cities were centres of modernist culture and progressive thought. Its working class had one of the most developed labour movements in the world. And yet this society produced Adolf Hitler, elevated him to power, and followed him, with varying degrees of enthusiasm and varying degrees of compulsion, into a war that ended with the deaths of 10% of Germany's own population and the near total physical destruction of its cities. How? The answer, which historians are still working to fully understand, involves the specific historical conjuncture we have examined in this video. The traumatic defeat of 1918, the humiliations of Versailles, the destabilizing effects of hyperinflation and the Great Depression, the structural weaknesses of the Weimar Republic, the ideological traditions of German nationalism and anti-Semitism, the failures of the conservative establishment, and above all the specific genius and specific madness of Adolf Hitler himself. The men and women who appear in the other videos of this channel, the field marshals who commanded Hitler's armies, the generals who executed his orders, the wives who stood by their husbands in the Nazi elite, the children who grew up in the shadow of their parents' crimes, the U-boat crews who fought the Battle of the Atlantic, the Waffen-SS soldiers who were the most ideologically committed instrument of his regime, all of them were in some sense participants in the project that Hitler had set in motion. Some were willing and enthusiastic, some were coerced, some were swept along by circumstances they had failed to understand early enough to resist. Their individual fates, examined in those videos, are fascinating and often disturbing in their complexity. But to understand why those fates unfolded as they did, why these people were involved in the conflict at all, why the world was plunged into the most destructive war in history, you have to come back to the question we have explored here. Why did Hitler have to start World War II? And the answer, in all its historical complexity, is that he started it because he had always intended to, because his entire political career from 1919 to 1939 was the systematic preparation for this war, and because the combination of his ideological convictions, his personal psychology, his political genius, the structural weaknesses of German democracy, the grievances of the German people, the failures of Western appeasement, and the brutal logic of his rearmament economy all converged in September 1939 to make war not merely possible, but, in his own mind, necessary, desirable, and inevitable. He was wrong about its outcome. He was not wrong that he was the man who made it happen. History does not repeat itself precisely, but it rhymes, and the story of how Adolf Hitler rose to power and started the most destructive war in history contains lessons that remain urgently relevant. The combination of genuine social grievances, economic desperation, ideological extremism, contempt for democratic institutions, the exploitation of nationalism, and scapegoating of minorities, the willingness of mainstream politicians to make tactical alliances with demagogues they think they can control, and the failure of international institutions to enforce collective norms against aggression, these are not unique features of 1930s Germany. They are recurring human tendencies that every generation must resist with clear eyes and strong institutions. The men and women of the 1930s who failed to stop Hitler failed, most of them, not because they were evil, but because they were afraid or mistaken or too committed to short-term interests to see the long-term danger, or simply unable to believe that a civilized modern nation could be led by someone who genuinely meant what he said. The lesson, perhaps the most important lesson of the entire terrible story we have explored today, is to believe people when they tell you what they intend to do. Hitler told the world in Mein Kampf, in his speeches, in the Hossbach Memorandum, and in every diplomatic encounter from 1933 to 1939, exactly what he intended to do. The world chose not to. Believe him until it was too late. Well, that is it for today. Thank you so much for watching. We hope this video gave you a deeper understanding of one of the most profound and consequential questions in all of modern history. Why Hitler had to start the Second World War. The answers are uncomfortable and complex, involving not just one man's madness, but the failures and choices of an entire generation of nations and leaders. If you want to go deeper into this world, make sure to check out our other videos exploring what happened to Germany's top field marshals after the war, what the German generals truly thought of their Allied counterparts, what became of the wives and children of Nazi leaders, and the extraordinary stories of the Waffen-SS and the U-boats after 1945. Each of those videos adds another dimension to the story we have told here today. If you found this video informative and thought-provoking, please give it a like and share it with anyone who wants to understand this history more deeply. Subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss another deep dive into the history of the Second World War. We will see you in the next one.